You ever just raise your hand at the wrong time? That's basically what happened here, except the consequences were a little more permanent. Welcome to the Aztec Empire, where volunteering for the most important job in the world came with exactly one downside. They kill you at the end. Let's talk about it. First question, who on earth says yes to this? Because it wasn't random. It wasn't like they were grabbing people off the street. The volunteers came from very specific places. A lot of them were prisoners of war, captured in battle by Aztec warriors. And in Aztec culture, that wasn't just defeat, that was actually a path to honor. You could be sacrificed willingly, or you could resist, struggle, and cry. And the second option was considered deeply shameful, so a lot of warriors chose to go through with it proudly. But war captives weren't the only ones. Some families were just devastatingly poor, and a priest would show up at their door and tell them their child had been chosen, and that the child would go to live with the gods. Not die, transform. Because here's the thing you have to understand about the Aztec world. The sun needed human hearts to keep moving. That wasn't a metaphor. Without sacrifice, the sun stopped, the crops died, the world ended. So sacrifice wasn't murder, it was the most important job in the universe. Which brings us to the ixiptla. Every year during the Feast of Tezcat, one young man was chosen to become Tezcatlipoca. Not represent him, not dress up as him, become him. He wore the god's ornaments, he carried the god's smoking mirror. He had flowers woven into his hair every single day, and he walked freely through the capital city of Tenochtitlan. Everywhere he went, people threw themselves on the floor, not for him, for the god walking inside him. He had 8 personal attendants, 8 people whose entire job was making sure he was comfortable. He was taught to play the flute, because Tezcatlipoca was the god of music and night, and as he walked through the streets playing, people believed they were hearing the voice of a god. He ate the finest food in the empire, he wore the best clothes, he went wherever he wanted. He was treated in every possible way like a living deity. And look, I know what you're thinking. That actually sounds incredible. And you're right, for a while it genuinely was. But here's where it starts to get complicated. You can't leave. You're watched every single hour of every single day, and everyone around you knows exactly what's coming. The attendants know, the city knows, the people bowing in the streets know. You're the one who has to figure out how to live with that information. And the priests were very good at managing that. If you started looking too comfortable, too attached to being alive, they'd disrupt your sleep, let your appearance go, remind you gently what you actually are. Because you couldn't seem too human. The moment you looked like a man afraid of dying, the whole sacred illusion fell apart. So your entire existence was a performance, a carefully managed year-long performance. And the sources are honest about what happened sometimes. The young man would begin to weep as the date got closer. The priests expected it. They had a word for that moment, and their solution was more music, more ceremony, more food. The weeping wasn't a problem. It was part of the script. But let's talk about what a normal day actually looked like, because people imagined it was just feasting and music. And yes, there was feasting and music, but there was also structure, rigid, unbreakable structure. He woke up at a specific time. He was bathed, dressed, and adorned by attendants. The flowers in his hair were replaced every single morning, fresh ones, every day. Because a god doesn't wear yesterday's flowers. Then came the procession. Every day he walked through the city, the same route more or less, playing his flute. Crowds gathering, people watching, some weeping just from being near him. Then the feasting, then the music, then sleep. And then the next day, the exact same thing again, day after day after day, for a full year. And here's something nobody talks about. That kind of existence gets strange very quickly. You're not really a person anymore. You're a role. Every conversation you have is with someone who sees a god, not a man. Every meal is a ritual, not just dinner. Every walk through the city is a performance, not a stroll. You can't complain, you can't have a bad day, you can't be bored or tired or irritable, because gods don't get bored, gods don't get tired, and you are the god. So you perform every single day for a year. Now, let's talk about the selection process, because they didn't just grab anyone. The ixiptla had to be physically perfect. No scars, no blemishes, straight limbs, clear skin, good teeth, bright eyes. He had to be tall enough, proportioned correctly, because a god couldn't inhabit a broken vessel. And if, during the year, the ixiptla got a scar, or developed a skin condition, or gained too much weight, they'd replace him, swap him out for someone else. The old one would still be sacrificed, by the way, just not as Tezcatlipoca, as a lesser offering. So on top of everything else, you had to stay physically perfect for an entire year, while eating the best food in the empire, while barely moving, while being carried everywhere. Good luck with that. And there's another detail that's easy to miss. The ixiptla wasn't just one person at a time. There were multiple festivals throughout the year, multiple gods requiring embodiment, multiple ixiptla living out their own versions of this story simultaneously. Across the city, at any given time, there were people living as gods, counting down to the same ending. And they knew about each other. They would sometimes see each other in processions, two gods nodding at each other across a plaza, both knowing, neither saying a word. 20 days before the end, something changed. He was given 4 wives, young women who themselves were living embodiments of goddesses. They feasted together, they danced together, they were paraded through the streets together. For 20 days, it was pure celebration. And then the wives said goodbye. On the final day, they were taken away, and he would never see them again. Then he was placed in a canoe, taken across the lake to a small, quiet temple outside the city. Not the great Templo Mayor, somewhere smaller, more private. He climbed the steps himself. Nobody carried him. He walked up on his own. And in his hands he carried a bundle of flutes, the flutes he had played all year, the sound people had heard as the voice of God. And at every single step on the way up, he snapped one in half, one flute per step, broken and left behind him on the stairs. By the time he reached the top, there was nothing left in his hands, and at the top, the priests were waiting. The method was fast, an obsidian blade below the ribs, the heart still beating, raised towards the sun. His body was carried down carefully, not thrown, carried, because even now he was still a god. And the next year, a new young man would be chosen, and the whole thing would begin again. Now, Tezcatlipoca's ixiptla gets the most attention because of the drama of that single year, but the system ran across many gods and many festivals, and some of them are even harder to sit with. Tlaloc was the rain god, and Tlaloc had a specific requirement. He needed children, small children, sometimes toddlers, and the ritual required that they cry, because Tlaloc was associated with rain, and tears were rain. Parents were told their child was going to Tlacan, Tlaloc's paradise, a lush, green afterlife full of flowers and water and abundance. Not death, a promotion. And many of them genuinely believed that. That's the part that's almost impossible to understand from the outside. The theological framework was so complete, so woven into every part of daily life, that this was an act of love, a terrible, devastating act of love. Let's talk about the tzompantli for a second, because this is where it gets visually brutal. After the sacrifice, the skull wasn't buried, it wasn't hidden, it was displayed on a massive wooden rack outside the Templo Mayor. Thousands of skulls, row after row after row. And when the Spanish arrived in 1519, they counted them. One Spanish soldier wrote that there were so many skulls he lost count. Modern archaeologists have since excavated the site, and the numbers were staggering. Hundreds of towers, tens of thousands of skulls, all on public display, in the center of the city, where everyone could see them every single day. And here's the thing, for Aztec citizens, that wasn't horror. That was a monument. That was proof. Proof that the empire was fulfilling its cosmic duty. Proof that the sun would rise tomorrow. Proof that the rain would come. The skull rack was a receipt. Payment confirmed, world still running. You're welcome. Now let's zoom out for a second, because it's easy to look at this from the outside and think these people were uniquely brutal, but that would be missing the point entirely. Every civilization on Earth has had things that seemed completely normal to them and completely monstrous to everyone who came after. The Aztecs genuinely believed the universe required maintenance, that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world, that the debt had to be repaid constantly, in blood. And within that framework, being the sacrifice wasn't a death sentence, it was a calling, the highest possible calling. The person who kept the sun moving, who paid the debt the gods were owed, who held the whole world together for one more year. That's not nothing, that's everything. So did they actually believe it? That's the question historians still wrestle with. And the honest answer is yes, and also sometimes no. And both of those things were true at the same time. The Aztec worldview wasn't just a set of stories people chose to accept. It was the total structure of reality. The sun rising every morning was proof the sacrifices worked. The rain coming in season
was proof Tlaloc had received his payment. When your entire observable world confirms the system, doubt is very hard to sustain. But the cracks show up in the sources. Captives who had to be physically dragged to the stone, the ixiptla weeping as the date approached, priests whose job was partly just keeping the offering emotionally stable, which only makes sense if the offering was sometimes not emotionally stable. People were people. The theology was total, but the body knows what's coming, and no ceremony fully silences that. There's one more thing worth saying. When the Spanish arrived and eventually conquered Tenochtitlan in 1521, one of the first things they did was tear down the tzompantli. They burned the temples, they built a cathedral on top of the Templo Mayor, and they wrote extensively about how barbaric the Aztecs were, how savage, how primitive, how obviously wrong. And those Spanish soldiers just finished a conquest that killed hundreds of thousands of people through warfare, disease, and enslavement. So, maybe be a little careful about who's calling who barbaric. The Aztecs had a reason for what they did, a cosmological reason, a theological reason, a deeply held reason. It was wrong by any modern standard, but it wasn't senseless, it wasn't random cruelty. It was a civilization doing what it genuinely believed the universe required. And that's a much more interesting thing to sit with than simple judgment. So here's why it actually sucks to be a sacrifice volunteer. Not because the honor wasn't real, it was real. Not because the food wasn't good, it was extraordinary. Not because the reverence wasn't genuine, the whole city bowed when you walked past. It sucks because of the gap. The gap between being treated as a god and knowing somewhere underneath all of it that you are still just a man. The gap between the year of abundance and the morning of the stone. The gap between what your culture tells you death means and what it feels like to climb those stairs, breaking your flutes one by one, with nothing left in your hands at the top. They gave you everything, the food, the music, the wives, the reverence, and then they asked the one thing you couldn't get back. You volunteered, you were honored, you were ended, and the sun, as always, kept moving. If you want more videos like this, the next one is about why Aztec warriors actually tried to lose on purpose. Subscribe so you don't miss it.